David Parker.
As Leanne Dalzell and Charles Chauvel have both said, we will be supporting this bill in this reading as we did in the earlier reading. Just following on from the last speaker in respect of how close things have become between New Zealand and Australia, of course there's a notable exception of that, and that is relating to the ever-increasing wage gap between New Zealand and Australia. And important though the Trans-Tasman Proceeding Bill is in making proceedings easier between the countries, it's probably not quite as important as closing that wage gap. And of course at the last election we had the national government promising that they were going to close the wage gap with Australia. But the problem is they've said they're going to do it by 2025. And we can't get any particularity from them as to an intermediate milestone. And you might say, well, that doesn't matter that much if it's going in the right direction, they'll get there eventually. But of course the reality is it's not going in the right direction, and the wage gap grows ever wider, ever wider. And unfortunately the national government doesn't understand this, because they had Jerry Brownlee down here trying to palaver us that it was actually growing narrower, and we had John Key doing the same, only to be called slippery by Television 3. A terrible thing that your Prime Minister so misrepresents statistics is called slippery. Now the Trans-Tasman Proceeding Bill is not going to make a difference between the wages in Australia and New Zealand. Well, they might let Jerry Brownlee speak on this bill, but they haven't let him answer questions on the more important issue about what's happening to that wage gap. They haven't given us any milestone that we can judge, or New Zealanders can judge their performance between now and 2025. And of course we all know that 2025 is a decade and a half away. Most of the National Party people that are currently here, they'll be superannuitants by that age, unless, of course, they change the age for superannuation by that time. The Trans-Tasman Proceeding Bill, which simplifies the... Look, sartorial elegance is obviously something that would be new to Tauranga, but we celebrate it on this side of the chamber occasionally. Mr. Speaker, the Trans-Tasman Proceeding Bill essentially makes it easier to carry out civil proceedings in Australia or New Zealand. There are a number of changes that are made. We, for example, make it easier to serve documents in Australia in respect of a proceeding that's been initiated in New Zealand. And the quid pro quo for that is that if there's a civil proceeding appropriately commenced in Australia, we make it easier to serve those documents in New Zealand on New Zealand-based parties to that legislation. There are equivalent provisions in the comparable legislation which is being passed in Australia. And in addition to that, there are powers for people to... There are provisions in the legislation on both sides which say that if the proceeding is inappropriately started in one country, then you can apply for a stay of proceedings in that country while you go to the other country and initiate your proceedings. So that guards against people picking what might be the most convenient jurisdiction for them to start their proceeding. It might be convenient to them, but it might be inappropriate in the context of the case. So a party can then go to the court, seek a stay of proceedings. Cutler, a good brand. Mr. Speaker, returning to the more important issue as to when is it we are going to get some milestones from the government on which they can be held accountable for real progress in closing the gap with Australian wages. It was the foundation principle upon which they fought the last election. They told New Zealanders, you should be jealous of the position of Australians and we're going to fix it. They said that they would fix it, that they would close the wage gap when it's going in the opposite direction. We've asked them time and again for milestones and they declined to provide them. The latest two iterations of economic policy that we've seen from the National Party were dated August, the 1st of August this year, predated by a February iteration of the same document. No reference to the Trans-Tasman Proceeding Bill in either of them, because of course it is peripheral only to economic performance. But in the February document, we had the government saying they were going to cause a step change in the economy. They were going to open up further areas like Schedule 4 areas for mining, and they were going to have a financial services hub.
Order.
None of those plans. Plans appear in the latest iteration, and this Trans-Tasman proceeding bill will have absolutely.
Point of order, David Garrett.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not entirely comfortable with raising this point, but it's the second time I've done so with the opposition. David Parker appears to be dressed in some kind of safari jacket. I noticed that standing orders require business attire. I personally, Mr. Speaker, would welcome a ruling which did not require us to wear these silly things around our necks, but I invite you, sir, to make a ruling on what is appropriate. But I certainly do not see that what Mr. Parker is wearing right now is business attire.
Well, order. There's a point of order being considered. I thank the member for that. In terms of wearing ties, our standing orders require business attire, and that's what we have to comply with. That's the standard set in this House. In terms of the jacket the Honourable David Parker is wearing, I think that, in my view, that fills the bill as business attire, and I'm quite comfortable that is acceptable. The Honourable David Parker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A man of discerning taste, unlike the member for Tauranga. Mr. Speaker, in terms of the Trans-Tasman proceeding bill, it makes a very small contribution to the efficiency of the New Zealand and Australian economies. It will help the New Zealand economy a very, very small amount catch up with Australia, but no meaningful step has been taken by this government in terms of bridging that gap. Indeed, the Herald has said, in respect of the economic policy of the government, that they have not done much more than tinker with the Resource Management Act and the such like. Those were the words, I think, tinker with the Resource Management Act and the such like. And they also said that if small steps are taken, then only small progress is made, and indeed things can go backwards. And that indeed is what is happening. That is what is happening under this government. The economic performance of this country relative to Australia is worsening. The wage cap is getting bigger, and this bill will not be the answer because it doesn't have much of an effect on the economic performance of New Zealand. A good bill though it is, it goes to legal processes rather than to the economic performance of this country. So I would hope that subsequent speakers from National will get up and tell the country what are the milestones that they are willing to set that would allow them to be judged as to whether they are achieving that step change in the economy that they promised everyone, even as recently as February this year, but it's dropped out of their current rhetoric, what they're doing to bridge the wage gap with Australia, because I'm afraid that I'm not willing to wait till 2025 to judge whether they're succeeding in that promise or not, and I don't think most New Zealanders are either. Mr. Speaker, the other changes that were made at Select Committee in respect of this legislation were largely technical. We did approach the Australian legislature and see if we could change the wording of some of their legislation as well, and as a consequence there is better alignment of both bills on each side of the Tasman, and I commend this bill to the House.
I call Kanwalja